Welcome to Hidden History, Story from the Secret City. I'm your host, Ray Smith, co-host. Keith McDaniel is normally here with me, but he's not here today. I'm just making a presentation that I've wanted to put on here for some time. It's called The Women in the Workplace During the Manhattan Project and a little after the Manhattan Project. I hope you'll enjoy that. Uh, let's go ahead and get started with it. Let me share my screen. First, let me point out the photograph that you're looking at. That is a photo made by a drone at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. In the foreground is, in fact, the laboratory, a really good aerial view of it. And you can see the lake over to the right. And also, looking to the left, you can see the spallation neutron source up on top of Chestnut Ridge. And even further, you can see the two water towers and Y12 in Bear Creek Valley and in the city of Oak Ridge, just across Pine Ridge. And you can even see the Bull Run Steam Plant, soon to be the home of a fusion energy research project. So it's a good overview of the area with the laboratory in the foreground. Now, I won't take much time with this. It's a slide that I use to introduce my presentations. I do want to tell you about Delina, a little community, a crossroads community in southern Middle Tennessee where I grew up. I've written a history book about Delina. It's a bestseller. All 25 people that live there have bought copies of it. I married my high school sweetheart in Petersburg High School, Fanny. You need to know that our little class of 25 people, there wasn't but just a few, one or two very pretty girls in that class. But in the class ahead of me, there were about a half a dozen really good looking girls. And Fanny was one of them. But although we'd been going to school together since the first grade, she wouldn't have anything to do with me. When I would speak to her in the hallway, she'd turn her head. So I went to her cousin who was in my grade, and I told her, I said, look, I want to date Fanny, but she won't pay any attention to me. Will you help me get to have a date with her? She said, sure, Ray, I'll help you. So she come to me in a day or two and said, Ray, she's going to be sitting in the study hall just to the right of the main door, and she knows you're coming. So I said, okay. I strutted into the study hall, looked to my right, saw Fanny sitting at a table there, and I winked at her. She winked back. A year later, we were married, and we had 57 wonderful years of marriage together. And I'm a Vietnam veteran in 68 and 69. And I often tell the story that Fanny and I traveled a lot after we retired, went to Europe a number of times. On one of those trips, we were on Viking River cruise, and they put us on a bus and took us up to Normandy, put us off at the American Cemetery there at Omaha Beach. And they were doing a ceremony at the monument of the man coming up out of the water. They asked for a veteran to lay the wreath there, so I volunteered. After I laid the wreath, they said, any other veterans in the audience, come up and let us recognize you. About 20 other people came up, and they said all the standard stuff. Thank you for your service. And when they finished, the man standing right beside me just turned to me and said, welcome home. Now that's a dead giveaway. He's a Vietnam vet. We didn't get welcomed home. I didn't wear my uniform when I came home. So I just said to him, when were you in country? He said 1968 and 69. Now that's when I was there. And immediately two other men standing very near us at the same time said, I was there in 68 and 69. Now, don't you know that's unusual? 4 Vietnam veterans who were there at the same time, standing together under this monument at the American Cemetery at Omaha Beach. We didn't talk. We just looked at one another. We knew what we'd been through. But Fanny was standing over to the side, not knowing what was going on, but just making pictures. And when we got back to the ship that night, she was looking at her pictures, and she'd made a picture of the 4 of us standing there under that monument. Highlight of all of my European travels. So I retired from Y-12 after 47 years as their historian. I'm now the historian for the city of Oak Ridge, commissioner on Tennessee Historical Commission, elder emeritus at Highland View, and a chaplain emeritus for the Oak Ridge Police Department. Well, enough about me. Let's talk about the women. Oh, before we do that, let me remind you about this picture of Oppenheimer, Robert Oppenheimer. He was only in Oak Ridge a few times. Ed Westcott made this picture. And notice the mantelpiece up there. He was sitting right by the fireplace in the guest house at that time when he made the picture. And of course, the movie came out about Oppenheimer in July of 2023. And that brought attention to how much was he in Oak Ridge. His brother, Frank Oppenheimer, lived in Oak Ridge and worked at Y-12. And Robert visited at least a few times. He had dinner with Colonel Nichols and his family, and actually brought him a gift from San Francisco, or from Santa Fe, New Mexico. And he also had influence on the building of S50, the thermal diffusion plant. So he was involved and knew about Oak Ridge. He actually sent Richard Feynman here to tell Tennessee Eastman not to store their uranium on either side of a concrete wall, because Tennessee Eastman didn't realize that the neutrons would go right through that wall. So anyway, Richard Feynman, one of my favorite scientists, was sent to Oak Ridge to tell them not to do that. So I took this picture and framed it and put it up on that same mantelpiece at the Alexander Guest House, which is a refurbished senior living center that was originally the guest house. And Rick Dover, when he refurbished it, he did everything he could to keep as much of it original as possible. And the fireplace and the floor and the main lobby are all original. The other thing I'm showing you there is a historical display that's in the lobby of the Alexander Guest House. I bring 65 passenger buses up to that guest house and let them come in and see this historical display. Those people living there are delighted to see tour buses come up. The guest house, Alexander Guest House, is listed as a part of the Manhattan Project National Historical Park. And speaking of bus tours, oh, by the way, this is the chair that Oppenheimer was sitting in. It's a little statue that I brought back from Washington, D.C. when the Atomic Heritage Foundation closed their office up there. It's just a small statue, about 3 foot tall, but there's a life-size one out at Los Alamos, along with one of General Groves. Shame on us. We need some statues as well. We need to show Colonel Nichols for one, and Alvin Weinberg for another, and also Admiral Rickover because of the nuclear navy. But we're attempting to do that now, and I'm proud to say that we've got the Wildcat Manufacturing at the Oak Ridge High School helping us work on the idea of statues. And we're moving right along on a statue of Ed Westcott, which I'm really glad to see the Oak Ridge Heritage and Preservation Association deciding to pursue that. And they've actually have it under contract now that we're going to get a statue of Ed. I won't show you the video of the Oppenheimer movie, but I'll tell you that I've done 65 bus tours, tourist bus tours, since the Oppenheimer movie came out. So it's done a lot to increase our heritage tourism in Oak Ridge, although the words Oak Ridge is only mentioned twice in the movie and Tennessee mentioned once. So we're reaping the benefit of the Oppenheimer movie. If you've not seen it, you really ought to watch it. It's available streaming on TV now. Now let's transition to women and talk about the women in the Manhattan Project, and some that were just a little after the project and some even later I want to mention. But this book, The Girls of Atomic City by Denise Kiernan, is a thing that really brought out attention to the women in Oak Ridge who were working during the Manhattan Project, who were many of them, the operators of the Calutrons, stands for California University Cyclotron, invented by Ernest Lawrence, that were at Y12, 1,152 of them, operated by these young girls right out of high school. And Denise saw this picture on the internet and called me and said, Ray, I want to write a book about the women in Oak Ridge. And I said, okay, I'll help you. I'll introduce you to them. I introduced her to one woman, Colleen Black, and that was all I had to do. Colleen took over from there and introduced her to all the others that she interviewed in the book. And Denise has done a great job promoting this book around the nation, and also it's been printed in several foreign languages. So she did, in fact, become an ambassador for Oak Ridge, and she did a lot to promote knowledge about us. In 2014, we gave her a key to the city and awarded her a Muddy Boot Award by the East Tennessee Economic Council. Very appropriate to do that. These young girls right out of high school, this one right here is Gladys Owens. Now, they're called Calutron girls, but that really is not what they were called during the day, during the Manhattan Project. They were called cubicle operators. These were the cubicles for those Calutrons, and they were the operators. This is their supervisor, Connie Bowling is who he is. This lady seated here is the last Calutron girl that I had, Ruth Huddleston. And now back to Gladys Owens. Gladys worked in Y12 from January till August of 1945. And as you know, when the war ended, there were a lot of people that were laid off. And by December of 1946, they were shutting down all the Calutrons except those in Beta 3 and 9731, because the gaseous diffusion process, which could operate at 1/10 the cost, it was a continuous operation where these Calutrons were batch processes, but it could operate much more efficiently than could these Calutrons at Y12. So she came back to Oak Ridge in 2004. And she saw herself in this picture at the American Museum of Science and Energy. She told Steve Stowe, who was the director at that time, said, that's me in that picture there. So Steve called me and he said, Ray, I found you a Calutron girl. Now, we started using that term right from that conversation. I started calling them Calutron girls, promoting the idea, and all of a sudden, that term caught on. And now everyone thinks of these young girls right out of high school as Calutron girls. I think that's really neat that a phrase could be turned and could become so prominent throughout our conversation that they are now almost always referred to as Calutron girls. For a number of years there, when anyone came down from headquarters, the NNSA, National Nuclear Security Administration, I'd get a call from Steve White, who was the communication manager, and he would say, Ray, I've got so-and-so, undersecretary this or undersecretary that or whatever coming tomorrow, and they want to meet a Calutron girl. So I would get one of them to be out there next morning, and we would let them meet them and just have a conversation with them. And Peggy Stewart, I called her one time and said, Peggy, whoever I named them, the undersecretary for this, that, or the other, which didn't mean anything to Peggy. I said, they're going to be at the New Hope Center tomorrow at 9 o'clock. I need you to be out there to meet them. She said, Ray, you don't understand. I don't get up till after 9 o'clock. But she was there every time I asked her to be there. And it was interesting to see the interaction between these young girls. When Gladys told Steve that that was her in the picture, and he called me, I arranged for her to come out to White Web, and we set her up on one of the Kayatron stools in Beta 3 and made her picture there by the controls. And she said, Ray, I never did know what I was doing when I was working here. Can you show me? I said, yeah, Gladys, I can show you. I opened up one of these cabinets and I said, Gladys, when you were adjusting these knobs, and that's what they did all day, just to keep a meter on a certain point, let it drift to a control point, and then bring it back. I said, you were changing the value of a rheostat down here. She reached over and tapped me on the arm. She said, Ray, I still don't know what I was doing, but I know if I had any bobby pins in my hair, they'd just go stick to the wall somewhere. Largest magnets in the world at the time were there, and they would literally pull any metal object, the hairpins, bobby pins, right out of her hair, and they'd go stick to the wall. Now, I want to show you this little Kayatron girl video that Explore Oak Ridge has created, and it's a fun thing to watch. Let's see if we can get it to run.
Well, hello again. It's Katie the Kayatron girl, and Oak Ridge, Tennessee has been my home since the 1940s. So much has changed now that we don't have to keep it zipped anymore. We're sharing our secrets with everybody. Well, it's now time for me to share one of my secrets with you. What exactly is a Kayatron girl? Time for a history lesson from yours truly. In 1932, Ernest Lawrence invented the Kayatron machine in his lab at the University of California, Berkeley, to split uranium-235 from uranium-238. You see, Kayatron stands for California University Cyclotron. Here at Y12 in Oak Ridge, we had 1,152 batch processes, Kayatrons, that ran 24/7 for 2 years straight. Split between two different types of machines, alphas and betas. It took a workforce of over 22,000 people working around the clock here in Oak Ridge to do our small part to help win the war. That's where little old me comes in. You see, due to the war, there weren't enough men around to keep the Kayatrons running. So the US government went out to local schools and recruited some hardworking, whip-smart young ladies who knew how to get a job done. Now, what that job was, they couldn't tell us. What we did know is that we were helping lead our nation to victory and get life back to normal. We just had to take a few precautions along the way. Keep quiet about the work we were doing. Don't wear any medals. The wildest part is that when it was all said and done, this 2-year round-the-clock endeavor produced less than a gallon in volume of uranium-235, the necessary material to arm the little boy atomic bomb and end the war. Well, I loved pulling the curtain back and telling you a little bit about my life story. As always, you can learn about all the secrets of Oak Ridge by going to exploreoakridge.com. Until next time, it's Katie the California University Cyclotron girl. Yeah, that's a mouthful. Katie the Kayatron girl, signing on.
So that's a modern way that we're talking about the Kayatron girls. Now, here's an example of a woman brazing, likely at K25 during the Manhattan Project. They were doing all kinds of work that needed to be done, not just monitoring and adjusting those Kayatrons, but doing other kinds of work. Colleen Black was a leak tester at K25, for example. Now, this is Peggy Stewart on my right there, and Ruth Huddleston on my left. They were two of the Kayatron girls that I was able to engage after Gladys Owens. Peggy was a hugger. She loved to, and she was a great humorist. And this lady here is Virginia. She was a scientist, not a Calutron girl. And there she is with Ruth and Peggy and the Rosie the Riveters that came down during one of our Secret City festivals. Virginia Coleman is her name, and she became very close with Denise and Joe when they were doing their research here in Oak Ridge on the girls of Atomic City. They got to know Virginia so well that they would just stay at her home when they came over to do the research. She welcomed them into her home, and they got to know one another really well. And that was a good relationship that formed during the writing of that book. It was published in 2013. Here's an example of that Deputy Secretary of Energy coming and wanting to meet Calutron girls. And I brought these two out to the New Hope Center for them to meet. This conversation here between Ruth and the National Nuclear Security Administration administrator is an interesting one. Ruth and I had a routine we would go through. I would ask her, Ruth, what did you think you were doing when you were working at Y-12 during the Manhattan Project? And she'd say, Ray, I didn't know. I just knew we were doing something to help win the war. And I said, oh, well, what did you think when you found out what you were doing? And she would say, well, I was at work and our supervisor told us that the bomb that had just been dropped on Hiroshima that day was made out of the uranium that we were separating here at Y-12. And she said, I was proud because my boyfriend was in Germany and he'd already told me that he was going to be sent to Japan. So I thought, I've saved his life. We're going to end the war now before he has to go. And then she said, when I got home that night, I read in the newspaper and heard on the radio about how many people we'd killed. And she said, I got so depressed, I couldn't sleep for a week. Now, when we did that, and this administrator is there, she teared up and leaned over to Ruth and said, let me tell you why I understand how you felt. Let me tell you what my job is. And she proceeded to tell her that she's the one that has to sign the letter that tells the president that our nuclear weapons are ready to use and if needed can be used and that they'll work. And she said, and we surely hope that that never happens. Well, Ruth said, oh, I know this man over in North Korea is trying to build a bomb now. And the administrator said, yes, I know. When we're going to send the president over there and see if we can, we've tried everything we know to try to keep them from doing that. And Ruth said, well, I sure hope they don't get mad. And that broke the conversation up. But that's an example to tell you how important these Calutron girls were and how significant it is to the top levels of the organization to understand and appreciate what was being done. Here's another lady that was very active during the Manhattan Project, Jane Greer. She was a statistician. She went to the University of Tennessee and wanted to apply for an engineering degree, and they told her that they didn't accept women into the engineering program, but that she could take all of the courses that she would have been required to take for the engineering degree, and they would give her a statistician degree. Well, that's what she did. And then she worked at Y-12 in building 9731 as a statistician. Now, this is the torchbearer from UT with an article about Jane published in 2010. And notice that Peyton Manning is giving her a trophy recognizing all of the work that she did after the Manhattan Project to support sports, and they recognized that she was a very valuable alumni from Tennessee, the University of Tennessee, and wrote up the story about her life. And she was delighted to get that recognition. And of course, how all this happened, Denise writing her book, a lot of it is because of Ed Westcott, not only this photograph, but other photographs that he made. And each time Denise and Joe would come to Oak Ridge, I would arrange for them to go by Ed Westcott's house and just spend a little time with Ed and getting to know him. And they became fast friends. And it was great to see that relationship develop. She also was able to get to know Bill Wilcox. Bill was our first historian for the city of Oak Ridge. He was also the chemist that handled the first shipment of uranium-235 that went to Los Alamos. Later on, he was the technical director for both Y-12 and K-25 for a number of years. So Bill is a very prominent individual in the history of Oak Ridge and did a tremendous amount of effort to help preserve the history of the K-25 gaseous diffusion plant. I'm proud to say that we're soon to complete a viewing platform there that I believe might not even exist if it were not for the encouragement and the 8 different recommendations that he provided, along with the Partnership for the Preservation of K-25, PKP, that he did. He developed and utilized to recommend to the Department of Energy how to preserve the history out there. These are some of the young ladies, and this is Colleen Black with a local book group, and that's Colleen in the center. And she was a tremendous lady. That's her, along with Cindy Kelly and Denise, promoting the book at, I believe they're located in the bookstore in Oak Ridge. This is only half of a group that the Oak Ridge Book Club that were reading Denise's book when I made a presentation to them about her book. And Rosemary Lane at another one of the book clubs. There was just an enormous amount of interest in Denise's book. This is a Polish translation of The Girls of Atomic City. Now, this is where they're at the bookstore, Books A Million in Oak Ridge, where Denise is promoting the book. And Rosemary and Denise at the National Book Festival in at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. This is Colleen Black in her younger years adorning the bottle of Atomic City cocktail. Got no proof. Colleen was a jewel. And Ruth Carey, East Tennessee History Center reception for Denise. And Ruth was able to be there with her at that time. Colleen and several of the others who were featured in Denise's book would routinely on Friday mornings meet at the Panera Bread restaurant, and they would bring their pens with them, and people would bring books by for them to sign, and they would autograph the Girls of Atomic City, and they did it for a number of times on Friday morning. And we're just delighted to be recognized as being featured in Denise's book. This is General Groves Administrative Assistant Celia Klemsky showing her book off, and I believe that's at, I'm not sure where it is. This is Helen Jernigan, also someone who was recognized in the book, and again, very proud to have been in the book. Now out in paperback, of course, and it was a bestseller within the first week, as it was in hardback. Now, this is what General Groves had to say about these Tennessee girls. I couldn't say this today, but I can quote him. Above all, I knew the labor supply of East Tennessee was of a very high order from the standpoint of willingness to work. I knew we had to use many female operators. Tennessee girls would be much more easily trained, would do better work than those of some other sections of the country. The principal reason for this was that the women here were not sophisticated. They hadn't been reared to believe they knew it all. That's what General Groves had to say. This particular picture here that Denise saw is one of the shift changes. Now a 20-foot by 50-foot mural in the cafeteria at Y12. And when we were opening the New Hope Center and the Jack Case Center in 2007, I put this picture in the Oak Ridger and said, any of you ladies who are still living, come and have lunch with us and help us cut the ribbons for these new buildings. 5 of them contacted me, this lady here, this one back here, that one, and this lady right here with the coat over her arm was Miss Atomic Bomb in 1945. But anyway, they came, those 5, and were helped us to cut the ribbons. Now I want you to notice this man standing here. Now when Ed made this picture, he was in the bed of a pickup truck and saying, okay, ladies, walk toward me. And those buildings in the background, that's Alpha 1, Alpha 2, everybody's walking toward Ed except this man. He's just standing there like a knot on a log. When we were finishing the Nuclear Family, a 4-part, 30-minute episode series for public television about the history of Y12, we wanted to have something to wrap up that series. So we remade this picture and had some of these people are descended from the ones that were in the original picture and had them walking toward the camera. And we put Ed in it and told Ed, stand still, Ed. That's me walking behind him saying, don't move, Ed. And we recreated the picture in front of the highly enriched uranium materials facility and put Ed in it standing like that man who was standing there like a knot on the log. Denise has brought out several new books. That's Fanny and me over. She lives in Asheville, North Carolina. And she brought out the book, The Last Castle, which is about the Biltmore House in Asheville, North Carolina. And she wrote about the Vanderbilts. Then she's written another book, We Gather Together, which is about Thanksgiving, how Thanksgiving came to be. And she and Joe have written other books, signing their lives away, about the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, signing their rights away, the ones who signed the Constitution, and stuff every American should know about our history. So she's a prolific writer and continues working on other books even as we speak. This is where Ruth was on a Zoom call with a group from of city folks out in the Midwest. And this is where Denise came and had conversations in Oak Ridge with these girls of Atomic City, and it was a really neat program at the American Museum of Science and Energy. That's Peggy and Ruth. And then let's talk about the Army Corps and the Manhattan Project. It was interesting to me to learn about this, and I wanted to share that with you. The Women's Air Corps was 74 men reporting initially, women reporting initially. And then they were sent to Oak Ridge, and they also went to Los Alamos and a few in Hanford. By the war's end, there were 422 of them that were working, and these are the ones that were actually in Oak Ridge. They did all kinds of work: stenographers, typists, clerks, telephone operators, handled records and reports. Some became technicians. And one of them was Wilma Betty Gray, and she enlisted in the Army in 44 and they wanted to speed the war effort. Their older sister was a prisoner of war, and she aborted a train and didn't know where she was going, but she was actually coming to Oak Ridge. So she's one of the women that worked here in Oak Ridge. And she said it was a bit dirty, a bit dusty, and a bit muddy. She worked as the general secretary for the Safety, Security, Fire Prevention Office at K-25. She was promoted to staff sergeant, and she also met her future husband. He was an engineer in the Special Engineer Detachment. And this is the person that wrote the story. Oh, how can you say anything about women in the nuclear era without mentioning Marie Curie, who awarded 2 Nobel Prizes, and her daughter actually won a Nobel Prize as well. She discovered radium and radioactivity. Lise Meitner was overlooked for a 1945 Nobel Prize, which was awarded to Otto Hahn for the discovery of nuclear fission. She was actually awarded the Enrico Fermi Award in 1966, and Element 109 is named for her. This lady, Catherine Way, is the one who suggested to William Pollard that the X-10 graphite reactor should be a national laboratory. So she's the one that got it started. William Pollard got 14 Southern universities to join a consortium and exerted the political pressure needed to get the graphite reactor designated as a national laboratory. By March of 1948. It was named officially the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And it all started because at a conversation, Catherine Way suggested that there was much more value in this graphite reactor than just proving you could produce plutonium. And this is another lady who was passed over for a new Nobel Prize, but she has an asteroid named for her. And of course, Leona Woods, the youngest person and the only female at CP1, Critical Pile 1, the first atomic reactor that was produced in Chicago. And then she was at during the Manhattan Project, she was out at Hanford, and she was the one that recognized that the reactors were being shut down because of a poison that was coming into the system. And she was able to tell them how to correct that and keep that chemical reaction from happening, and to be able to use the to produce the plutonium in those uranium reactors. Now I want to jump beyond the Manhattan Project and talk about Oak Ridge Associated University's Radiation Internal Dose Information Center. And this is Evelyn Watson. She headed that up and was a good friend. My wife, Fanny, worked for her for a number of years. And we were invited to a roundtable in Vail, Colorado. And I was invited because of talking about Oak Ridge. There were other people there who had various things that they could share as well. And there was a person there that was a retired Navy SEAL, and another one who was a retired Blue Angel pilot, and even a third one who was the commander of SEAL Team 6, the SEAL team that took out Osama bin Laden. So we were excited to be included among a group of of members at a roundtable with the kind of involvement that they had, that Oak Ridge would be recognized. And I told the person who was coordinating the roundtable, I said, look, I would like to give each of us were given an hour. And I said, I'd like to give half my time to my wife, Fanny, and let her talk about this Radiation Internal Dose Information Center where she worked for a number of years. He said, oh, that's so good. I'll just give her an hour or two. So Actually, Fanny was the hit of the program because they didn't have any idea about these nuclear accidents that had happened around the world, and the Radiation Internal Dose Information Center had calculated the dosage for all of them. And Fanny was able to tell some about that, as she was an administrative assistant who typed up all those reports. So she had picked up a good bit of information there. And then there's Leanne and Bill Russell. They were biologists, were hired to come to Oak Ridge, and she's an amazing lady, and they I want to show you a video.
From modest and humble beginnings
the
to secret
biology.
missions to being one of America's best resources for new technology, these valleys in East Tennessee have a rich and diverse history. We want to honor those who came before us. We want to keep our place in history alive by revealing the secrets of our hidden past. (1946), the Second World War had ended, a war that Y-12 worked tirelessly to help end. In spite of its efforts to help win the war, Y-12's whole existence was threatened. You see, the K-25 gaseous diffusion process had come to be regarded as more productive for enriching uranium, more productive than Y-12's wartime calutrons. The once booming Y-12 quickly went from over 22,000 employees down to less than 2,000, and many buildings were left vacant. Just over Chestnut Ridge, a sister facility was facing its own set of challenges after the war. X-10 had just become a national lab, the Clinton National Laboratory to be exact, and was well on its way to becoming the Oak Ridge National Laboratory that we know today. And then there was the fashioning of a whole new division, a division that would be focused on research and study the effects of radiation on living things, on organisms like fungi, plants, mammals, insects, a biology division. And for the director of this new division, the then director of research and development at the Clinton Labs, Dr. Eugene Wigner, looked to the National Institute of Health.
They were trying to find somebody, and they asked some people at the National Institutes of Health about it, and nobody was interested, but Hollander was interested and came up with a program immediately about particularly genetic research, and sure enough, they funded it.
Turned out Dr. Alexander Hollander was the perfect choice. A German immigrant, he already knew a thing or two about radiation and living things. He'd been working on research of his own, studying the effects of ultraviolet radiation on living organisms. He was driven, focused, and a visionary. Hollander saw a facility that looked not just into the radiological effects on living things. He visualized a research facility for all things biological and biomedical that shared ideas and findings, a research facility that collaborated with other researchers around the world. But for a research facility of this size, well, X-10 found himself in quite a quandary. There just wasn't any space available or money for new construction. Money was tight following World War II for all government facilities. And so building a new building for a new division simply was not an option.
And they didn't have much room over here at ORNL. But they did have a lot of buildings over at Y-12. And when the war effort winded down, those buildings were vacated. And so it made a perfect opportunity for a growing research division to expand into that area.
Buildings like 9207, 9208, 9210, and 9211 that were once used to prepare material for the Y-12 calutrons were left vacant and were big enough to accommodate this new biological research division for the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. But of course, security was tight at Y-12, and this posed a problem for the new division. But sensible German Hollander had a solution for that.
Alex was trying to negotiate for the use of a building. Finally, he yelled, "Well, why can't you build a fence around us?" That made it a done deal. He got that building and the adjacent one, both surrounded by a security fence.
But these buildings weren't intended for biological research, so some renovations were needed. But Hollander had already started assembling his team, so he found temporary labs for those researchers to begin work.
It was in a wing of the building that also housed the original X-Tank cafeteria. We only had just maybe 3 or 4 rooms, maybe more than that in the wing. And the end room became the mouse room. And all of it was a very temporary housing. We knew we were going to be moving, so it didn't much matter.
Slowly, as renovations were finished, each team of researchers would move into their new facilities.
The rest of the biology division moved before we did because their facilities were in a different building and they had been completed before ours. Our particular group moved in probably January of 1949. We moved into building 9210
And so began the renowned Oak Ridge National Laboratory's Biology Division and the fantastic discoveries that would change the world of science and medicine forever. Research done here in the Bear Creek Valley at Y-12. It was the early 1950s. The nation was at rest following its greatest war. But in the quiet valleys of East Tennessee, a small group of scientists was beginning to cause quite a stir. The Oak Ridge National Laboratory was pioneering research on living things. Only this research wasn't happening at the lab itself. It was taking place on the other side of Chestnut Ridge at Y-12. In buildings donated to the lab by Y-12, the new biology division found a home. It was here at Y-12 where some great scientific minds assembled that ORNL became a world leader in biological research. Some of the early breakthroughs came from the persistent efforts of a hardworking husband and wife team. Working in a building nicknamed the Mouse House, Doctors Bill and Leanne Russell were studying how radiation affects reproduction in mammals. While Bill studied these effects on reproductive cells, Leanne focused on the effects in the earliest stages of life.
I was getting involved in mapping of the developmental stages, embryonic developmental stages, at which you would get different types and different degrees and different frequencies of various malformations, like, legs and toes and ribs and all that kind of stuff. Making the correspondence between the timing of mouse embryos and human embryos. It turned out that some of the really hazardous stages were during a time when most women would not realize that they were pregnant. And so we made this recommendation that if radiation could be postponed, like if it was a diagnostic radiation, that it should be scheduled to the 2 weeks following menstrual period. So that became known as the 14-day rule. Some people call it the 10-day rule. And it was adopted fairly early, like in the 50s. And it's been internationally in use ever since then. For the 50 years that followed, the 14-day rule has helped prevent millions of potential birth defects. The other Dr. Russell, Bill, is not here to tell us about his research, but his legacy lives on. I think his very early work was wonderful, the one with ovarian transplantation. But after he got here, I think finding the various conditions that changed mutation rates were what he considered most significant. Another very important one was the so-called dose rate effect, namely that if you spread out the dose instead of giving it all in one shot, that the mutation rate dropped to about 1/3.
This discovery led to the national and international standards for safe levels of radiation exposure for humans that we still use today. Now, during this time, another scientist was getting some notice, putting things on ice. Dr. Peter Mazur's specialty was cryobiology.
Cryobiology is the scientific study of the effect of cold on living organisms. People had attempted to freeze embryos and eggs, but had gotten absolutely nowhere. And so we're beginning to understand the factors under which cells were killed or not killed. So we took the knowledge we had and said, well, it seems to us this is the way we ought to do it, try it. And it was a pretty heady experience because we tried 2 experiments, and in those 2 experiments solved the problem basically in 10 days. And one of the tests of whether you successfully frozen embryos is to transfer them into a foster mother, a surrogate, and see if you get baby mice. And lo and behold, we got baby mice. In fact, those baby mice appeared on the cover of Science magazine in October of 1972.
In similar research, Mazur and his team successfully froze sperm that was later injected into a female mouse, and the pregnancy took. This technique was quickly adopted by the livestock industry.
2008, I think it was, the cattle industry froze 250 million doses of bull sperm, and those were used to inseminate 100 million cows over the world, and this resulted in a tremendous increase in the genetic productivity of cattle.
These discoveries create even more possibilities for the future, like preserving organs for transplant and preserving endangered animals. These are but a few of the snapshots of contributions made by ORNL's Biology Division, contributions that have left a long legacy made here at Y12.
So think about other women in the Manhattan Project and ask yourself, who do you think of? What women do you think of when asked this question? Jim Campbell suggested to me that Dottie Silverman was one that he thought of. She was assistant in the chemistry division at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, assigned to Waldo Kahn, and who also ran the Oak Ridge Civic Music Association. And she was the secretary to the Oak Ridge chapter of the Federation of Atomic Scientists. Doris Scott was an Oak Ridge National Laboratory nurse from 1945 to 1955. She graduated from Meharry Medical School. And in the 40s, a meningitis outbreak hit Oak Ridge's Black community really hard. She worked with the local agencies and the local hospital to share health information with the families and helped organize the Citizens Committee, Health Committee. In 1952, President Harriman Truman appointed her to serve on the industrial health section of the President's Committee for Health. She was just one of 10 professionals invited to join the panel. Frances Pleasanton, Arthur Snell described in an article headlining Proof of Neutrons Radioactivity Obtained by Physics at ORNL, how he and Pleasanton opened the hole in the 7-foot thick concrete shield of the graphite reactor to get a stream of neutrons in a defined beam. He describes the two pursuits that they were able to accomplish because of that. And she authored and co-authored a number of scientific publications. And her lab was visited in 1958 by Queen Frederica of Greece and 59 by young King Hussein of Jordan. She remained in Oak Ridge after retirement. And then Libby Johnson, an ORNL physicist, demonstrates a new control panel at the bulk shielding facility. She helped to operate. She was among the first female operators to operate a nuclear reactor. And she blazed the trail for women for sure. So that concludes the presentation that I made about the women of the Manhattan Project and some later than the Manhattan Project that were significant in their contributions to the nuclear era. Our next guest on Hidden History, Stories from the Secret City, will be Michelle Shockley. And she has a new book coming out, All We Thought We Knew. And interestingly enough, this book is about World War II, but it's about Tullahoma, Tennessee. It's about the area that was used there for German prisoners of war. And I think you'll find it interesting what she has to say about that particular era of our time. And I think it's a book you'll thoroughly enjoy learning about, and the situation that was here in Tennessee that not many people know very much about. She'll be our guest at the next Hidden History, Stories from the Secret City. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.